Now you mothers particularly. The only way you can resist this war hysteria and beating of tom-toms is by asserting the love you bear for your boy. When you listen to some well-worded, some well-delivered war speech, just remember it's nothing but sound. No amount of sound can make up to you for the loss of your boy. After you've heard one of those speeches and your blood's all hot and you want to bite somebody like Hitler, go upstairs to where your boy's asleep. Look at him. Put your hand on that spot on the back of his neck, the place you used to love to kiss when he was a baby. Just rub it a little. You won't wake him up. He knows it's you. Just look at his strong, fine, young body, because only the best boys are chosen for war. Look at this splendid young creature who's part of yourself. Then close your eyes for a moment, and I'll tell you what can happen. Somewhere 5,000 miles from home, night, darkness, cold, a drizzling rain. The noise is terrific. All hell has broken loose. A star shell burst in the air. Its unearthly flare lights up the muddy field. There's a lot of tangled, rusty barbed wires out there, and a boy hanging over them, his stomach ripped out, and he's feebly calling for help and water. His lips are white and drawn. He's in agony. There's your boy. The same boy who's lying in bed tonight. The same boy who trusts you. Are you going to run out on him? Are you going to let someone beat a drum or blow a bugle and make him chase after it? Thank God, this is a democracy, and by your voice and your vote, you can save your boy. Smedley Butler's Letter to Mothers.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking the strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words and letting it all behind. I'm coming up from underneath the red.
Hi everyone. I hope you enjoyed that reading of Smedley Butler's Letter to Mothers. You'll also find it referred to as his Message to Mothers in other online resources. I also made a video of it to share from our YouTube page, and I'll have the link to that in the show notes. It's not as well known as his small book War Is A Racket, but I think it's powerful nonetheless. So, if you're not familiar with this or War Is A Racket or Smedley Butler himself, I'd like to take a few minutes in this episode to go over those things. But first, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast on whatever podcast you're using. If you don't know where to subscribe, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe to find links on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube. If you like what we're doing, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. It will help us reach more listeners and grow the show. And another way to help us is by becoming a supporting listener through Patreon. Thank you, Joseph, for becoming our newest patron. Your financial support will help us with the operating cost and grows the show. If anyone else is interested in becoming a patron, visit us on Patreon or anarchochristian.com/support. And thank you again, Joseph, for your financial support. All right. Have you ever been even slightly critical of the war on terror or the war on drugs and heard the response, "Have you served?" As if you can't have a critical opinion if you hadn't served, and yet you don't have to have served to support them. Personally, I don't think you have to have served in the military or the police to be skeptical or critical of the wars. Even though some people have, and it does seem to lend a little more legitimacy to their criticism, at least to the perception of the war supporters. So, even if you haven't served, there is a voice that seems to have gone silent over the last few decades, but thankfully, Smedley Butler has seen a bit of a revival after the seemingly endless wars in the Middle East. I hope this episode will not just be a good introduction to Smedley Butler and his book, War Is A Racket, but also give you sufficient ammo when you are faced with that question, have you served? Smedley Butler was born in Pennsylvania in 1881. He is known as the most decorated Marine, and he was awarded 2 Congressional Medals of Honor from Mexico in 1914 and Haiti in 1917. And he holds a Distinguished Service Medal from 1919. Before his retirement in 1931, he held the highest rank of Major General. After he retired, he became an outspoken anti-war voice, exposing numerous misdeeds by our government during his service, and penning the enormously important, yet short book, War Is A Racket. It's about an hour to read, but I thought I'd try my best to give you a thorough summation of it. Hopefully it will inspire you to read it in its entirety or give you the highlights that you need to combat the question, have you served? There's 5 chapters, and there were so many good points made in the first chapter, I decided to just read the whole thing through. Then I'll sum up the other chapters. So here's Chapter 1. Chapter 1. War is a Racket. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small, inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few, at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. In the World War, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the World War. That many admitted their huge blood gains in their income tax returns. How many other war millionaires falsified their tax returns, no one knows. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights, ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried a bayonet thrust of an enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? Out of war, nations acquire additional territory. If they are victorious, they just take it. This newly acquired territory promptly is exploited by the few. The self-same few who wrung dollars out of blood in the war. The general public shoulders the bill. And what is this bill? This bill renders a horrible accounting, newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression and all its attendant miseries, backbreaking taxation for generations and generations. For a great many years, as a soldier, I had suspicion that war was a racket. Not until I retired to civil life did I fully realize it. Now that I see the international war clouds gathering as they are today, I must face it and speak out. Again, they are choosing sides. France and Russia met and agreed to stand side by side. Italy and Austria hurried to make a similar agreement. Poland and Germany cast sheep's eyes at each other, forgetting, for the one unique occasion, their dispute over the Polish corridor. The assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia complicated matters. Yugoslavia and Hungary, long bitter enemies, were almost at each other's throats. Italy was ready to jump in, but France was waiting. So was Czechoslovakia. All of them are looking ahead to war. Not the people, not those who fight and pay and die. Only those who foment wars and remain safely at home to profit. There are 40 million men under arms in the world today, and our statesmen and diplomats have the temerity to say that war is not in the making. Hell's bells. Are these 40 million men being trained to be dancers? Not in Italy, to be sure. Premier Mussolini knows what they are being trained for. He, at least, is frank enough to speak out. Only the other day, Il Duce, in International Conciliation, the publication of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, said, "And above all, fascism, the more it considers and observes the future and the development of humanity, quite apart from the political considerations of the moment, believes neither in the possibility nor the utility of perpetual peace. War alone brings up to its highest tension all human energy and puts the stamp of nobility upon the people who have the courage to meet it." Undoubtedly, Mussolini means exactly what he says. His well-trained army, his great fleet of planes, and even his navy are ready for war, anxious for it apparently. His recent stand at the side of Hungary in the latter's dispute with Yugoslavia showed that, and the hurried mobilization of his troops on the Austrian border after the assassination of Dollfuss showed it too. There are others in Europe whose saber-rattling presages war sooner or later. Herr Hitler, with his rearming Germany and his constant demands for more and more arms, is an equal, if not greater, menace to peace. France only recently increased the terms of military service for its youth from a year to 18 months. Yes, all over, nations are camping in their arms. The mad dogs of Europe are on the loose. In the Orient, the maneuvering is more adroit. Back in 1904, when Russia and Japan fought, we kicked out our old friends the Russians and backed Japan. Then our very generous international bankers were financing Japan. Now the trend is to poison us against the Japanese. What does the open door policy to China mean to us? Our trade with China is about $90 million a year. Or the Philippine Islands? We have spent about $600 million in the Philippines in 35 years, and we, our bankers and industrialists and speculators, have private investments there of less than $200 million. Then, to save that China trade of about $90 million, or to protect these private investments of less than $200 million in the Philippines, we would be all stirred up to hate Japan and go to war. A war that might well cost us tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives of Americans, and many more hundreds of thousands of physically maimed and mentally unbalanced men. Of course, for this loss, there would be a compensating profit. Fortunes would be made. Millions and billions of dollars would be piled up by a few munitions makers, bankers, shipbuilders, manufacturers, meat packers, speculators. They would fare well. Yes, they are getting ready for another war. Why shouldn't they? It pays high dividends. But what does it profit the men who are killed? What does it profit their mothers and sisters, their wives and their sweethearts? what does it profit their children? What does it profit anyone except the very few to whom war means huge profits? Yes, and what does it profit the nation? Take our own case. Until 1898, we didn't own a bit of territory outside of the mainland in North America. At that time, our national debt was a little more than $1 billion. Then, we became internationally minded. We forgot or shunted aside the advice of the father of our country. We forgot George Washington's warning about entangling alliances. We went to war. We acquired outside territory. At the end of the World War period, as a direct result of our fiddling in international affairs, our national debt had jumped to over $25 billion. Our total favorable trade balance during the 25-year period was about $24 billion. Therefore, on a purely bookkeeping basis, we ran a little behind year for year. And that foreign trade might well have been ours without the wars. It would have been far cheaper, not to say safer, for the average American who pays the bills to stay out of foreign entanglements. For a very few, this racket, like bootlegging and other underworld rackets, brings fancy profits, but the cost of operations is always transferred to the people who do not profit. In Chapter 2, Who Makes the Profits?, Butler goes into detail of how many industries and specific companies profited greatly from the war. Everything from munitions manufacturers, leather companies with boots and saddles, and even bankers. He breaks down a lot of the math with specific dollar amounts and percentages gained by these companies. In Chapter 3, Who Pays the Bills?, Butler details how the bankers profited from the war and strongly condemns the way soldiers were taken advantage of. There are a few of my favorite quotes from the book in this chapter, so I'm going to read out a couple of them for you now. In the World War, we used propaganda to make the boys accept conscription. They were made to feel ashamed if they didn't join the army. So vicious was this war propaganda that even God was brought into it. With few exceptions, our clergymen joined in the clamor to kill, kill, kill. To kill the Germans. God is on our side. It is His will that the Germans be killed. And in Germany, the good pastors called upon the Germans to kill the Allies, to please the same God. That was a part of the general propaganda built up to make people war conscious and murder conscious. And a little later he writes, "Beautiful ideals were painted for our boys who were sent out to die. No one mentioned to them as they marched away that their going and their dying would mean huge war profits." So I think by now you can see why this book is so important and timely and timeless, really. The things that he's been bringing up this entire time just doesn't go away in history. It's the same thing over and over again. I think it was Mark Twain who's credited with saying, "History rhymes." In Chapter 4, Smedley Butler gives us a few examples of how to smash the racket. He summarizes it as 1. We must take the profit out of war. 2. We must permit the youth of the land who would bear arms to decide whether or not there should be war. And 3. We must limit our military forces to home defense purposes. I think those are things that even the most vocal war supporters back home would agree with. So in the last chapter, Chapter 5, he discusses how war can come even when people don't want it. He writes, looking back, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected president in 1916 on a platform that he had, quote, kept us out of war, end quote, and on the implied promise that he would, quote, keep us out of war, end quote. Yet 5 months later, he asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Smedley Butler continues to express how the war profiteers, the professional soldiers, bankers, and munitions makers, are all in favor of war, but he optimistically says they can profit outside of war. He He also leaves us with an observation that the weapons makers are looking to develop more and more fiendish mechanical and explosive instruments of destruction. It's sad to think that in just 10 years from his writing those words, the United States would drop 2 atomic bombs, intentionally targeting and killing 200,000 civilians. Maybe he didn't see exactly how that would happen, but he knew there was no boundary to the evil that war profiteering would bring. And this is why he ends his book with the quote, "To hell with war." So, I hope you enjoyed that. Again, I will have the links in the show notes to everything mentioned in the episode, the YouTube link to the intro, the Amazon link to the book, and while you're on Amazon, don't forget to check out the cool anarcho-Christian t-shirts. I'll also have links to subscribe to the show and to support us on Patreon. So until next time, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.